Hello music people. In this video, I'm going to talk about some conventional practices around chords and chord progressions and how you put chords along with a melody. What I've developed here is partly inspired by something called functional harmony and also inspired by just different just conventions and typical things that are done in popular music. Functional harmony is a word that you'll most commonly hear associated with Baroque era music or classical music. It's basically there's a bunch of rules, governing which chords you can use and when. And it's totally fine to break those rules sometimes if you're wanting to make a particular artistic or stylistic choice. And there's a bunch of different ways that popular music breaks those rules as well. But as you're continuing to learn about chords, chord progressions, how to place them with melody, I want you to know what those rules are, so that if you break those rules, you're making a conscious stylistic choice to break them, and you're not just breaking them because you don't know any better, if that makes any sense. So what I'm going to be doing is I'll be talking, and I've got my piano here. I'm going to be playing along and demonstrating some of the concepts that I'm talking about. What I want to help you to avoid is I want to help you avoid just placing chords kind of randomly with a melody. Sometimes there's some songs that sort of sound like someone wrote the chords by just rolling the dice. Which chord should I do next? Oh, I'll roll it's that rolled a 3. Okay, I'll put a 3 chord. We don't want to have songs that that sound like that. And the other thing that I want you to think about is consider this another piece of criteria to consider when you are putting chords along with melodies. So far I've talked about 3 different criteria. In a previous video I talked about considering the notes of the melody, considering where those notes of the melody fall in terms of the strong beats and weak beats, and I've asked you to think about the duration of those notes of the melody. So this 4th piece of criteria is thinking about what the typical or conventional ways of using chords are. So I'm going to go through one at a time all of the Roman numeral chords that you've learned and talk to you about where they most typically lead. And I'm going to just be kind of playing along. I'll play along in the key of C. And the tonic chord is the easiest one to talk about because this is your foundational, fundamental, home base chord. Typically this is where your song starts and where your song ends, and so you can really go anywhere from the one chord. So your options are wide open when you start on the 1 chord. An important chord, of course, is the 5 chord. It's called the dominant chord, and most often the 5 chord leads to 1. There is just something about the 5 chord that has this pull toward resolving on the 1 chord. It pulls you back to your foundation, back to your home base, back to your tonic chord. And I can play you an example of that where you can feel that pull that 5 has to 1. So I might start with 1, go to 6, and then 2, and then 5. So I held out the 5 chord kind of for a long time, and then I finally resolved it on 1. And as I was holding out the 5 chord, if you felt the way I did, I felt there was this anticipation. It was almost like I was holding back a sneeze, or it was like a cliffhanger kind of a feeling that you get if you just hold on to the 5 chord and don't resolve it to 1. And then finally when you do resolve to 1, you're like, okay, phew, yeah, it's resolved, and I feel settled again, right? So so that's why The 5, most often will go to 1. I also want to point out that it also works, it's less common, but it also works for 5 to go to the 6 chord. And like the theoretical reason why that works is because the 1 chord and the 6 chord actually have 2 notes in common. So if you think about the key of C major, our 1 chord is C, and there's C, E, and G in the C major chord. The 6th chord is A minor, and A minor is A, C, and E. So those 2 chords both have the C note and the E note in them. So for that reason, 5 does work to go to 6. It's almost it's a very like artistic and almost kind of a deceptive chord change to do. So so if I did something similar to what I did before, if I go from 1, 6, 2, and then 5, and then instead of resolving to 1, I resolve to 6. It's almost like, oh, I wasn't expecting it to go in that direction, but somehow it works. So yeah, so 5 can go to 6 also. And I also want to point out that in blues, or in blues-based, blues-inspired music, 5 can go to 4. And in the world of functional harmony or classical music, 5 going to 4 is just a big no. That is just a huge rule broken. But this is a key characteristic of blues. And if you go to a blues concert, or if you listen to a lot of blues, chances are that you're going to hear something called the 12-bar blues pattern. It's called 12-bar blues, and it's basically, just this 12-bar loop of the same chord progression over and over again. There's got to be like a million different songs out there or more that are based off of the 12-bar blues. And I'm sure that you've heard it, or once I play it for you, you'll recognize it. You'll say, yeah, I kind of heard a song like that somewhere before. So 12-bar blues kind of goes like this. You start on 1, and you stay on the 1 chord for 4 bars, and then you'll go up to 4. This is 4, and now back to 1. Now here's the key part. We've got 5, 4 to 1. All right, so that was the 12-bar progression, and that very characteristic part is toward the end of it, where 5 goes to 4, goes to 1. All right, and so there's a lot of other songs too that will kind of have that idea in it. So something like, that's based off of a song in the 60s, Louie Louie, but I mean there's all kinds of songs that kind of have a similar sort of a sound to that, where I start on 1, go up to 4, 5, and then instead of 5 going to 1, it actually goes to 4 first and then goes to 1. So again, blues-based music, you might hear 5 going to 4, but anywhere else, most often it goes to 1. 6 is also kind of an artistic, deceptive kind of an option. Now, I also need to talk about predominant chords. Predominant, or before dominant. So the 2 chord and the 4 chord, most often they work really well leading up to the 5 chord, and that's why they're called predominant chords. They work best coming just before the 5 chord. And those 2 chords, in a way, are kind of interchangeable. And the reason is because, like the 1 and the 6 chord, the 4 and the 2 chord have 2 notes in common. So we're in the key of C. The 4 chord is F. And the F chord has F, A, and C in it. And then the 2 chord, D minor, has D, F, and A. So both the 4 and the 2 chord have F and A when you're in C major. So 2 is sort of a minor chord equivalent or an alternative, a minor chord alternative to the 4 chord. So you could go 1, 4, 5, 5, and then to 1. Or you could do 1, 2, 5, 1, 2. The 2-5-1 progression is more common in jazz and in classical music. 4-5-1 is more common in popular music. And I also just want to point out that 4 in pop, it can also go to 1. So we see that happening in the 12-bar blues pattern that I talked about earlier. 5 goes to 4, 4 goes to 1. It's acceptable. It's not crazy in pop music for 4 to go to 1. 5 to 1 is kind of a stronger progression. You kind of, because 5 has this stronger push to 1, but 4 going to 1 is acceptable in pop as well. And at this point, I just want to quickly mention that the 1 and the 4 and the 5 chords are such common chords, especially just in popular music, that they're called primary chords. There are lots of songs out there that are just built up of those 3 chords, 1, 4, and 5. And there's an even greater number of songs where maybe those aren't the only chords that you use, but they're used, 85% of the song will have either 1, 4, or 5. You might see a 6 or a 2 once in a while or something like that, but mostly 1, 4, 5 are used a lot. And that's why we start with teaching those chords to you, because those are your primary chords. Next, I want to talk about the 6th chord. Your options are really open when it comes to the 6th chord. It could go anywhere, but I want to point out that it works best or really well for the 6th chord to go either through the 2 or the 4 chord. If you think about an example like this, you might start on the 1 chord. Let's say I go from 1, 6, and then from 6, if I go to 4, then it makes sense for the 4 to go to 5, and then it makes sense for the 5 to go to 1. And in the process of doing that, I've just shown you a really common chord progression. 1, 6, 4, 5. This before, right? And there's any number of classic like 50s, 60s songs. So I bet you've heard that kind of sound, that idea before. So that is 1, 6, 4, 5. And I also want to demonstrate how 2 and 4 can be interchangeable. So instead of doing 1, 6, 4, 5, I could do 1, 6, 2, 5, and that sounds pretty cool too. So it has a similar sound to 1, 6, 4, 5, because 2 and 4 they can function in the same way. All right. So 6 could go to 2 or to 4, like I just said, but really it could go anywhere. It's just you can end up with a really nice, conventional, logical kind of a chord progression. If 6 goes to 2 or 4, one of those chords, they're predominant chords, they go to 5, and then 5 can go to 1. It's just nice and neat. Now I also need to talk about the 3 chord. And of all of the chords that you have learned, 3 is kind of the weakest, less common chord choice, especially if you're looking at like the ones that I've laid out here so far. Between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the weakest, least common one is the 3 chord. But if you are going to use it, if you kind of want to use it for an artistic reason, or to just use a kind of an unusual chord, it usually works best to go to either the 6 chord or the 4 chord. It leads well going to the 6. So if I start on 1, then up to the 6, and then I could go 4, 5. So that's a possible progression right there. 3, 6. I'll play it one more time. 4, 4, 5, 5, 1, 3, 6, 4, 4, 5, 5, 1. Okay, so that works. I also think it sounds pretty good to go up to 4, because in that way it kind of especially if you're going like from 1 to 3 to 4, it's almost like a passing chord. It's like a step just before you get to 4. You're just right underneath it at the 3 chords. So so like a chord progression could be like if I played like 1, 3, 4, and 5. 5. Okay. So, but as I say, 3 is not really used very much. The other chords I've talked about so far are much more common. And then I will just talk a bit about the 7 chord. This is a diminished chord. It's used in most music, it's probably used even less often than the 3 chord. And you can see this chord as being a substitute for the dominant chord. It kind of functions in a similar way to the dominant chord in that it has this really strong pull to the 1 chord. And I kind of like to use it, sometimes I use it after the 5 chord to kind of go in between 5 and 1. It just kind of extends that dominant chord sound, but just kind of varies it a little bit with that diminished 7. So so just as an example, I could go 1, 4, and then 5, 7, and then 1. All right. So when I listen to that chord progression, I end up hearing 7 as kind of an extension of the 5 chord. I'm just doing a little bit of a variance of the 5 chord at the end, and then just resolving to 1. Another interesting choice is if 7 goes to 3. 7 almost ends up being like a dominant chord for the 3 chord when you put it before 3. So so what could you do? I mean, you could actually go from 1 to 7 to 3. So let's see how that sounds. I could go. So I used like a lot of different chords there. But yeah, or I could go maybe 1, 2, 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. All right. So so what I did there, and those of you who are maybe come from a little bit more of a stronger background of theory may have heard or realized what I did there was I literally just went through the whole circle of fifths. I basically every chord that I played was separated by a fifth. I started on 1, and basically I went down by a fifth, down to the F chord. So C, C, B, A, G, F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then every chord that I played after that, they were fifths apart. So so 1 down a fifth to the 4 chord, down a fifth to the 7, down a fifth to the 3, down a fifth to the 6, down a fifth to the 2, down a fifth to the 5, and down a fifth to the 1. All right, so that's part of the reason why 7 also works leading to 3. All right, so I know this was a bunch to take in, but I hope it was helpful. And sometimes with a topic like this, it doesn't make as much sense as when you first hear it, but it makes more sense the more you start to apply some of these principles and these ideas. The more that you kind of hear the way that these chords can interact and how they sound best, the more that this will make sense. So I hope that's true for you, and I hope that this is helpful, and I will see you next time.